We all know about sequels, right? You have movies like Toy Story 2 or The Godfather Part 2 that were great. And then we had Jaws 2, which you probably didn't see just as well. It stunk. If a sequel continues the story and themes of an original, it can be a challenge to create a worthy sequel. The New Testament actually has a sequel inside of it. You see, the gospel writer Luke told the story of Jesus. He wrote this gospel. It begins with the birth of Jesus and the teachings of Christ and how he confronted injustice. And then it comes to a conclusion with Christ's death and his resurrection appearances. And then the gospel comes to that conclusion. It ends just like the other gospels do. But Luke added a sequel, a part 2. It's called the Book of Acts. Now, it's a little odd because our New Testament kind of got the order mixed up, and John's gospel got inserted between Luke and Acts, right? It goes Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. But even with that case, it is utterly clear that Luke wrote the book of Acts as the sequel. I mean, the opening words of it are, "In the first book I wrote about all that Jesus did and taught." The book of Acts is this part 2 that tells the earliest days of the church. Now, there's a lot at stake for the fledgling community. I mean, how are they going to make it without Jesus around in the flesh anymore? Are they going to organize themselves? How do they overcome obstacles? How do they not get absorbed in the culture? How do they live into Christ's values? This sequel, this book of Acts, is a story that's not with Jesus, but it's a story about the people who follow Jesus. Now, since in the book of Acts, Christ isn't walking around in the flesh anymore, in some ways, it's like our experience. We don't have the bodily form of Jesus walking around with us, and yet we are also trying to be followers, trying to follow his teachings and live into his spirit. In some ways, then, the book of Acts can be really helpful for us today. In the book of Acts, as you read it through, one of the things they had to deal with is controversy. I don't know, that's too bad, but maybe not surprising. The church has always had conflict throughout its history, internal disagreements that have fomented and caused lots of problems. We look at our church today, I'm talking about the bigger Christian church, there's a lot of division and a lot of disagreement about the role of women or how do you read Scripture. Episcopal Church, we've certainly had our conflicts and even small ones. You know, for example, the Episcopal Church right now is trying to figure out, should unbaptized people be able to receive communion? I think that they should, but the official church policy is that they shouldn't. People have different opinions on lots of different things, sometimes strong opinions. Well, the biggest controversy going on in the early church in the book of Acts, the controversy is whether they should include people who were non-Jews. Obviously, that's not an issue for us today, but for them, Jesus was Jewish, all of them were Jewish, this was a Jewish movement. Why should we include outsiders? It's interesting how the church seems to always be struggling with including people who might seem outside. Anyway, Jesus didn't make it clear what the policy was. I mean, and sometimes he seemed to include people outside the Jewish faith, and sometimes he seemed laser focused on the people of Israel. So without clarity from the boss, what are you going to do? How are they going to figure this out? So you see these first followers struggling. Well, what did Jesus want? They try to get in touch with what his mission was, and they also, it's interesting, listen to their own experiences, that they felt the Spirit moving among them as they reached out with the gospel to non-Jews. And then they had a gathering. They had a meeting. Right there in Acts chapter 15 is an event that's called the Jerusalem Council. Now, there were a lot of leaders there. Certainly, Peter was there, Paul was there. And although we can, think these gentlemen are so great, they're also flawed figures, right? I mean, Peter denied Jesus when Jesus needed him most. Paul was somebody who persecuted the earliest church. So imperfect leaders, actually a gathering of imperfect people, trying to figure out what Jesus would want them to do. But it wasn't just one person deciding. It says they listened to the Spirit's prompting, they came to a conclusion, one that not everyone was happy with. And that often happens. But they came to the conclusion of, yes, people who are non-Jews don't have to follow the Jewish law, and they can be full members. They set a tone there about the church wanting to include outsiders and to stretch. Important for us to try to keep living into. Well, this example from Acts shows, it's not going to always be easy to figure out controversies and disagreements. Try to listen to Jesus, especially made known through the scriptures. We try to listen to our experience, and then try to listen to each other, and maybe even have gatherings. And the Episcopal Church is actually pretty good at this. We gather a group like a vestry or an annual meeting or general convention, and we try to sort it out. Even in unofficial ways, how do we try to listen to each other, not just my point of view? And then the church does need to make some decisions. And sometimes you and I aren't going to agree with it. I'm not going to get my way. You're not going to get your way. And how do we stay connected, even when we don't agree with everything about what has been decided? To know that our voice still matters, and our presence still matters, even when we don't all agree. Some of what it means to be a community. One of the things that's actually most helpful when you read the book of Acts is to see what kind of community these first Christians were trying to have. What did they value? What was their mission? Well, one of the things they cared about was their internal community. They worshiped and prayed together. They cared deeply for each other. And one of the examples of how tight-knit they were is they actually shared their finances. They pooled their money together. I mean, in an almost shockingly communist way. But what an example to think of how much they felt connected and trusted and committed to each other, how generous they were to their own community. I find that inspiring. They cared about each other, they committed to each other, but they also cared about the greater hurting world. And you see that in the way they had this passion. They knew that the message of Jesus, that good news and that hope made a difference. And so they went out and stretched themselves, trying to reach the greater Mediterranean world as far as they could with that gospel message of Christ. That kind of stretching can certainly be a challenge to us sometimes shy Episcopalians. Many in contemporary society want a distance from the church. You know, they see it as kind of a hypocritical and flawed institution. I get it. Because sometimes the church can be a hypocritical and flawed group of imperfect people, imperfect leaders. Yet when you look at the book of Acts, from the very beginning, the way that Christ's story lives on is through a gathered group of followers. There's a Christian organization that has the title Acts 29. And I just think that's such a clever name because the book of Acts only has 28 chapters in it. So you get it? They're saying we're an institution. Our group is to be the next chapter in the book of Acts. Could it be that the people gathered here today, you and I, are part of this sequel? Part of this next chapter? You got the story of Jesus and the book of Acts. And then, is it our turn? Different characters, but maybe the same themes and values, struggling with controversy, generously caring about the people in our community, while we reach out beyond our walls with the message of love.